case has really brought us all here for very personal reasons. So we are going to do a little mini breakout for just a couple of minutes where you get to share with 3 to 4 other people about what brought you here today and why this case spoke to you personally. So I'll go first, and then I'll turn it over to Porter and Lou to share how this case has appealed to us personally. What I wrote about in the blog that many of you may have read is that, I was born in 1984. So I was in middle school when Britney Spears rose to fame. And, there's just a special place for those things in the media that were around when we were in middle school, and as we were growing into adulthood. And so following Britney has been a lot like following my own self kind of growing up. And I have really struggled with my own mental health, and seeing that her mental health has been so covered by the media in such detrimental ways really breaks my heart, because having had a firsthand experience with having to be institutionalized for my mental health crisis, I can't even imagine if that was broadcast, something so hurtful, something so personal, and something so vulnerable to the whole world. I can't imagine. And my heart really breaks knowing the own pain and suffering that I felt, and my own journey to kind of claw my way out and regain my sanity. I really can't imagine what that would be like for that to be in the media on a world stage. And so that's part of my interest. And I would like to introduce you to my colleague, Porter Jennings-McGarity, and she's our community facilitator for the Midwest. Porter, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, well, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. So as Alison mentioned, I am the community facilitator for the Midwest in Tennessee. And so my interest in this topic is really because we know that the research shows that the media has a strong influence on shaping Americans' values and opinions. And a personal example to me is with Britney Spears, because she's been so influential. And I wrote in my blog post that throughout each developmental phase of my life, I can remember following the media and watching what she was doing. And so, but it's only been as an adult that thinking back on that, I realized that while I was following her in the media, for example, when interview hosts have sexualized her as a child, that was normalized to me through those interactions. And so Britney Spears is as an example to me of how personally the media has had an influence on me. So with the Free Britney movement, I really think it can be an opportunity to have a conversation about serious mental illness and advocate for much needed mental health reform if these conversations are held.
Thanks so much, Porter. I'd like to introduce you all to Lou. I actually didn't ask you how to pronounce your last name. I'm going to guess that it's just Godbold. So Lou is the executive director of ECHO, a nonprofit providing training on trauma and resilience to survivors and service professionals. And as one of the Me Too silence breakers, Lou has given TV and press interviews internationally on the subject of trauma and sexual assault. Her writing has been published in the Huffington Post, The Imprint, Smithsonian Magazine, and Pacific Standard. And she wrote a brilliant piece that was published in Smithsonian Magazine, Britney Spears and the Age-Old History of Men Policing Women's Trauma. We're so honored to have you here today, Lou. Could you tell us why this case really spoke to you and your work? Oh, let me unmute you. I'm so sorry. So let's see.
I'm here. Well, first of all, hello to everyone. I think I know, I've met some of you for sure, Karen and Carrie, and probably have come across others of you in my, 11-year association with PACES as well as ACES connection. And I so value this community, and I value all of you. And when I came forward in 2017 about Harvey Weinstein, I chose to do it on PACES Connection just because I knew that there would be understanding and support. And so I can't thank you enough for being my tribe. So wonderful to be part of this. And I'm happy to support Alison and Porter, and was really interested by their invitation because, we all have our own take on this story. I think it impacts many of us very personally. And the aspect that really impacted me was seeing this poor woman, Britney Spears, having what I thought seemed to be pretty normal reactions to the stresses and the trauma in her life, and then being sectioned and institutionalized, and then finally, for 13 years, her all agency stripped from her. And for me, it was, I realized that I have this deep-seated fear hidden away somewhere. Probably it just kind of osmotically came into being after reading like Jane Eyre when I was a kid, and the mad wife locked away in the attic. And it's not so long ago that husbands were able to put women into insane asylums for doing things such as, being a bit of an upstart, or refusing to conform, or deciding that education was important to them when that was not what the Victorian mores of the time were about. So I realized that there actually was this historical response of men to women's trauma. And I don't think it's quite as easy to put your wife away if she wants an education anymore, thank God. But certainly what we saw with Britney and the interaction with her father brought up all of those ghosts for me. And it also reminded me of what Judith Herman talks about at the very beginning of her book, Trauma and Recovery. And if you haven't read that, I imagine most of you have, if you're on this
the best
site.
one.
Yeah, if you haven't read it, to me, there are many greats, Bruce Perry, Bessel van der Kolk. These are all, I think, really insightful people on trauma. But Judith Herman comes specifically from the perspective of sexual assault, and from a very female-centric place. So in the beginning of her book, she talked about how, you can read it in the article, but about hysteria being linked to the womb, and that's why hysterectomies were performed. I mean, that, to me, was just such a violation of bodily autonomy and rights. And so I put those things all together in the article, and I hoped to do it in a way that attracted the interest of people not like you, people who have not really heard about trauma, and get them thinking about trauma.
Thank you so much, Lou. And we're going to come back and talk about that a little more. I loved my breakout room with Karen, Miranda, and Celeste. I think you were just there and you disappeared. And we really started with some despair and really got around to some solutions. I was in a group with Karen, my colleague. I'm just going to unmute you if you could kind of summarize the solutions that we talked about.
I think we just moved from personal experiences to how all the way to how we've seen it in our communities and everything in between, from a journalist lens, from a first person lens, and different ways of seeing that. And we really ended our conversation about defunding the police, just seeing how when law enforcement or sheriff intervene in a mental health crisis, the outcome is often far worse than we might ever hope. At least in my community, we had at least 2 high school young males who were had a mental health crisis that were both killed. And so we were kind of talking about maybe some of the education and background that might bring somebody to become a law enforcement officer, or the education that's required to become one. So in the intersection really with the military training.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Karen. We invite you all, though, to turn your video on so we can see your faces and see you kind of react. So thank you in advance if you're able to do that. Porter is going to give an overview of conservatorships.
So essentially, conservatorships, or they're also called guardianships. So it's a little bit complicated to talk about just because the terminology and the specifics of what's involved vary based on the state. So in California, they're referred to as conservatorships. So when we're talking about Britney Spears, that's the term that you'll most often hear. But guardianships is the same thing in other states. So essentially, just conservatorship refers to the legal process in which an individual who is deemed to be unable to take care of themselves is given a guardian, essentially, that makes decisions for them. And historically, conservatorships were designed to protect individuals who were aging. And that had decline in cognition because of that. And it was a process meant to protect older adults, especially, those that had resources, from having people take advantage of them and having them risk losing their assets. Since then, it's evolved. And so what we have seen now is that in addition to older adults, conservatorships also are options for individuals that are deemed to be unable to take care of themselves because of a serious mental illness or an intellectual disability or developmental disability. So there's been a lot of debate as to the effectiveness of conservatorships. There's been a lot of concern that oftentimes what ends up happening in conservatorships is that human rights can be violated. But I think it's a very nuanced conversation, and we could have a whole session on, the pros and cons of conservatorships. I think it's important to kind of pay attention to all aspects. So in and of themselves, conservatorships are designed to protect individuals. So I think it's too simplistic to say, across the board, conservatorships are bad, because there are cases where if handled appropriately, that can be the best thing to protect an individual's well-being. Unfortunately, though, what we see is like other processes in our judicial system, depending on the different parties that are involved, sometimes the conservatorships aren't handled right. And so that oftentimes can result in them perhaps sometimes doing more harm to an individual than good, even though they're designed to protect them. So that's just a very brief overview.
Thank you so much. And I forgot when I introduced you to let everyone know that Porter has a master's in social work, a PhD in social work, and is a researcher in this field. So you're really hearing from an expert here. Denise asked, what's the oversight process? And Porter, you may or may not know that, and we can open that up to the group as well, but let me know.
So the oversight process for the conservatorship.
Mm-hmm.
So again, that's going to vary based on a lot of different things. So I think that that's the most important thing to get across is that, one, it's going to vary on what state you're in as far as what that process looks like. And also there's different types of conservatorships. So some that are more restrictive than others. So for example, there's one type of conservatorship where someone is just in charge of an individual's finances, and that's it. But then there's other types of conservatorships where, who the designated appointee is in charge of the individual's finances and their medical decisions, every type of decision. So the oversight process is going to vary based on that. But essentially, there is a very clearly delineated oversight process as far as whoever the person is that's in charge has to report back to the courts periodically to provide information on the progress of the individual. And so what that means, for example, is if they are in charge of the individual's finances, they have to show reports every so often to the courts to show what money has been spent and what has it been spent on. So there is an oversight process in place, but what most of the critiques of conservatorships is that in actuality, court systems are so overrun that the oversight process, it doesn't play out as it should. And so oftentimes things fall through the cracks. And so someone might not really be providing the and following the guidelines as they're supposed to, and that's not necessarily always caught by the court.
Well, and one thing, Porter, that you and I discussed in sort of reimagining this in a trauma-informed way, if the legal system, if every person in the legal system had the knowledge of ACEs and PACEs science and the physiology and biology of trauma and how it impacts our bodies, that you wouldn't see a situation where someone who had been an abusive parent, and I think it's fairly safe to say from the evidence that we've been given that there was the potential for Jamie Spears to be an abusive parent, since it was told by many sources that he struggled with alcohol addiction. There was also a restraining order put against him for being physically abusive to Britney Spears' sons. So obviously there's a couple key things here where you think, if you were trauma informed, you wouldn't take someone's abuser and make them a conservator. And I just wonder, Lou, do you have any comments on that, or anyone else? Please put them in the chat.
Yeah, I'd love to hear, because I think that we, as trauma-informed individuals, can really start to shape this conversation. And it's just lamentable at this stage. You know, the ACEs survey was done back in the 1990s. It's just lamentable that systems are not trauma-informed at this point. But there are just so many really simple things. For example, if you look at any kind of the European Bill of Rights, United Nations Bill of Rights, they have provisions for this kind of situation where somebody is deemed incompetent of being able to manage their own affairs. But in all of those, if you look at any of those lists of requirements, it talks about being for the shortest possible time. I don't think anyone could say 13 years is the shortest possible time. And then if you look at the way that, what really gets to me is the way that the professionals have colluded in all of this. So they definitely, the system's not trauma informed. The very institution of conservatorship is not trauma informed, because by definition, it strips you of autonomy and control, which is the first thing that a trauma survivor needs in order to recover. Judith Herman talks about that. Returning autonomy and control to the survivor is the guiding principle of trauma recovery, is what she says. But even the professionals involved are clearly not trauma informed. And it really got to me that one lawyer who she had interviewed to be her lawyer, he wanted to make sure that she was of a sound mind in order to be able to select him. And he determined that she was. And yet, and the whole goal of a lawyer is to, above all, pursue their client's interests. And that would have been certainly a safeguard in this situation if she'd had her own appointed lawyer who would have been able to pursue her own goals. But they came up with some secret psychiatric report, and the judge then decided that no, even though the lawyer had determined that she was competent to select him, he was going to override that. And this is what worries me. I've just said, you know, Bessel van der Kolk, Bruce Perry, some of the clearest thinkers and most insightful people, I think, on trauma. They're both psychiatrists. So I've got nothing against psychiatrists, but sometimes psychiatry is used in a really harmful manner. The fact that Britney said that she got down on her knees and thanked God when her psychiatrist died, that just raises all kinds of red flags. I mean, we know that it's not any particular kind of psychology that really helps. It's their therapeutic relationship, you know, in most mental health interactions, the therapeutic relationship. So how could that psychiatrist continue in that relationship when it must have been pretty obvious to him that Britney couldn't stand him, was frightened of him, did not want him as her mental health professional? That to me is just absolutely an offense against every ethic of that profession. And sadly, we give so much power to psychiatrists. I mean, he was given carte blanche to determine the judge's decisions in this case. And I would say, you know, 98% of psychiatrists out there are doing a really good job, but there are going to be those who abuse their position. And we talked about the gender nature of this, and I'm sure that you want to return that and discuss that. But if you think about Brian Wilson, I don't know if people are familiar with that case. that in that case, it was, again, his psychiatrist who was controlling the conservatorship and used it as a way to have power and to financially benefit from it. So what did I just say? I don't know. I think I just talked in a whole big circle, but the bottom line is none of this is trauma informed, and it should be.
Thank you. That was amazing. And there were a lot of folks resonating with you in the comments. And I wanted to unmute Shannon to share your comment, Shannon Wallmarker. So I'm going to ask you to unmute, and you just have to accept that. And
that's fine.
Awesome. Just go ahead and share the comment that you put in the chat.
Yeah, so I pretty much just said that men are perpetually believed over women, especially in the court system, just because, you know, like throughout history, we're just seen as more hysterical and, you know, non-logical. We're not able to make comprehensive and conscious decisions strictly because we are too emotional and hormonal and this, that, and the other. When, you know, that, and then when men come out in courts, you know, they're more believable. And usually if the judge or, you know, legal team are also male, a lot of the times they'll tend to just disregard what a woman says in court. And so that's where I feel like that's kind of also affected it in this case, because her father very much is getting the benefit of the doubt. And he's got a restraining order against him for abusing her own children, yet the courts are still siding with him, which just goes to show like how much they favor men over women.
Absolutely. Thank you, Shannon. Price, I see your hand. We just tend to do a little bit more where you just put your comment in the chat and then we just call on people to share their comments. So thank you so much. If you want to drop that in the chat, that'd be awesome. And we do absolutely want to hear from you. This brings me to a question that I had for Lou, and I just loved her article that I did put the link to, although I'm gonna drop it in the chat one more time to make sure that you all read this. When I found this article, I was like, oh, finally someone is talking about trauma. And then it turned out that Lou is a friend of Jane, our founders, and just a beloved member of Paces Connection. But in your article, Lou, you said, as Judith Herman says in her 1992 book, Trauma and Recovery, The Aftermath of Violence, what were once described as hysterical or today erratic behaviors are simply normal human responses to extreme circumstances. And so I was wondering if you could speak to what are the extreme circumstances that Britney has experienced? What exactly are those? And why are her responses normal? And how is her experience universal for women?
Well, first of all, thank you for the beloved member of the community. That's going to make me beam all day. I don't know Britney Spears, and I don't think anyone here does. So a lot of this is conjecture. And the only reason I feel comfortable doing this is because she wanted her story to be public, because she knew that that was how she was going to get out from under this oppressive control. But if you asked about the circumstances, well, you know that everyone has made a big deal about her thwacking a paparazzi's car with an umbrella. I think I would have thwacked him about the head, let alone his car. I mean, if you think about the stresses that she was facing, she'd had 2 kids within a year. She was breastfeeding the 2-month-old while she was going through the divorce. And she was being compelled to give up those children because they were sharing custody. And in addition to that, she was being hounded by the paparazzi, which, if you've ever experienced that, and I have, it is like being attacked by a swarm of bees. It would dysregulate the most calm and zen person. She's trying to do stuff like she's trying to put her baby in the car. And you know what they were trying to do. You know what it's like to put a baby in a car. You have to bend over and strap them in. They were trying to get an up the dress shot. They were trying to humiliate her in that situation. So she came in for a lot of scrutiny for then deciding just to give up with the car seat and just put her child on her lap and drive away that way. She was hounded so much that she ran into a store to try and get away from the paparazzi. I mean, talk about fight and flight. Which one of us would not have been in survival mode at that moment? And we all know, you know about the triune brain, you know about when we're in survival brain, it is our primitive instincts for survival that take over. And we're not about to sit down and have a nuanced conversation. When we're not in that part of our brain, we respond from the place of, I need to protect myself. I need to protect my children. And those behaviors were interpreted as being, generously wacky, or on the other end of the scale, worthy of being sectioned and strapped to a bloody gurney. I mean, it's, as you can see, I get pretty excited about it. But that's what I mean about these circumstances were enough to make anyone erupt. And that's all that happened. And then she barricaded herself, supposedly. She was in the bathroom with her children. She didn't want to give up her children because her visit had come to an end. And she was having a meltdown. I would be having a meltdown in that moment. And the other part of this, the contextual part of this, is that she's been controlled her whole life. I don't know if you read that actually Paris Hilton had to teach her how to use Google. That's how completely out of mainstream she was. That's how much she had been sheltered, and sheltered not in a good way, basically made incompetent on purpose. The other people took away every part of agency that a normal person would have, anyone else would have. And so there's also that accumulated sense of being directed and controlled every aspect of your life. I'm sure that also fueled some of these very strong emotional reactions she had. And at ECHO, we talk about that as having big feelings. That is not pathological. That's just having a big feeling. And I feel like she definitely has experienced trauma, and from my understanding, I don't know her, would really benefit from some help with working through her trauma. That much is clear. But it all seems very understandable, and it does not seem like pathology to me.
Thank you so much, Lou. That was very inspiring, and thanks for bringing all of that into this conversation. I think, you have really shed a lot of light on, the experiences that were reasonable, like in her adult life. And I'm very curious about the trauma she may have experienced as a child. Watching the Framing Britney Spears documentary, how many people, you can raise your hand or, do a thumbs up, react. How many people saw that? She started, in the entertainment industry very, very young. I was a little disturbed, and you all can tell me whether you agree or disagree with me, in that documentary when they showed a video of her performing at some sort of competition where she's singing a song. And I thought, and she's maybe 8 years old or 10 years old. She sounded like an adult woman. She had actually this deep, strong voice, and she was really singing this like imitation of like a more mature person. And that felt disturbing to me to watch, because oftentimes, for those of us who have a high ACEs score or work in this field around other people who have this, is that we get adultified or parentified from a young age, and we're expected to be an adult even though we're children, and children need to be free to play and be kids and mess up and be silly. And this video that they showed, which they were kind of saying, look how talented she was. But what I saw was, look how she's being adultified. Even as a small child, and how disturbed, I really felt disturbed by that. But I really would open that up to comments in the chat. And, when the Me Too movement broke, there was a series of articles that came out from people who, like Corey Feldman, and there were a few others about about rampant sexual abuse in the entertainment industry of children because there's no oversight. And so, Lou, I don't know, did you have any thoughts about, child abuse in the entertainment industry and what kind of trauma-informed oversight you'd like to see?
Yeah, actually, I have talked to Corey about his campaign, and it is very worrying because, as you said, there's no oversight, and a child's brain is developing, and so all of us are impacted by trauma, but never more so than when your brain is actually in development. The entertainment industry is a huge industry and has so many different parts to it. So it's really hard to talk about it in broad strokes. But the music industry is actually the least regulated of all parts of the entertainment industry. And I know some of the R. Kelly survivors, some of the Russell Simmons survivors, and I know someone who's trying to set up a movement within female composers for film and gaming. There's very few of them, and they get really badly sexually harassed and even assaulted. It is kind of the Wild West, sex and drugs and rock and roll. And there's a lot of resistance to changing that because people think that's edgy and cool. It's not, as you pointed out, for children, it's quite often exploitive. And I think there's been a lot of commentary on this. I myself am a child sexual abuse survivor. And so I really think it's beyond time that the Me Too movement looked at childhood sexual assault and abuse, because I can tell you, I've spoken to so many survivors, Me Too survivors of high profile abuses, and we all have one thing in common, and that is that we're also survivors of childhood sexual abuse. And someone got really upset with me when I said that because, and this is another survivor of a high profile abuse, she's like, Lou, it's not like we have a big target on our back. And it's not to put any shame on the person who's then sexually abused later on in life. Like, your childhood sexual abuse has somehow set you on this course, and there's nothing you can do about it. But what I'm saying is we should be paying attention to facts like lots of danger cues. I mean, some of the reason that we got into those situations is because this is normal. This is normal. I got nothing to worry about. Wham. Those things make a big difference. So if we're going to get to the root of any problem, it's always going to start in childhood. And I was communicating with my breakout room partner, Alyssa. Unfortunately, we couldn't speak. The mute was on, but whatever. And saying that at Echo, we do a lot of work with parents, because that, I think, is the best place to catch the intergenerational trauma. And, sometimes the trauma comes from outside the immediate family, but also teaching parents how to recognize trauma and then what to do about it. So that was a very long answer to your question. Did I answer it somewhere in there?
Yeah, definitely. And Jane, I'm going to call on you now that you shared. Jane is the founder and publisher at Pieces Connection. Love to have you weigh in on this question.
I'm also was sexually abused when I was a child, and it took me a long time, I would say until way in my 20s, before I understand that I could verbalize that wasn't that it happened to me. And then it took me even longer to figure out that a lot of the ways that I interacted with men was the way that I had been taught to interact with my stepfather. And I thought that was normal. And it was abnormal, it was hurting me, but I didn't understand what I was doing. And so as a friend of mine has said, you need to be educated about that what's normal and what's abnormal. And if your vision is that the things that happen to you are normal, then it takes a while to get rid of that. And it doesn't mean that, I was enticing people, but I didn't understand boundaries. I didn't understand what men were doing when they came onto me, and I responded. And, to your point about not having a target on your back, well, you don't have that exactly, but you might have some neon lights going on for people who understand that you can't make good decisions. So anyway, that was my point. And, and that's a tough thing to not feel guilty about. And I think that the PACES movement has done a lot, certainly for me personally, about that, but I think it's done a lot for people to understand that, we're just acting out what we learned, and we can change.
Thanks for sharing that, Jane, so much. And Jane, I keep in prepping for this, I kept coming back to that part of the film Cracked Up, and Jane and I did a series of episodes around Cracked Up, and what was brought up on there when Daryl Hammond finally got a psychiatrist to ask what happened to him. It took him so long. He had to see how many psychiatrists, right, before someone would say, what happened to you? And I, especially if Britney's, through her conservatorship, it's being like highly monitored which psychiatrist she gets to see. And I didn't know that, Lou, that she, got down on her knees and said thank you when her psychiatrist died, through this control of her life, that she doesn't have maybe the opportunity, for the right people to come in and ask that, and how much that breaks my heart. But that's something that I've been thinking about. So we have a few minutes, and we probably will just go maybe just 5 minutes over, but no longer than that. I did want to bring this back to Porter and talk about media and gender, which she talked about in her blog. And because I just want to touch on that before we end, because it's just such another important topic, especially for those of us who came of age around the time that Britney Spears and Paris Hilton, Lou, like you said, they were trying to get these shots to humiliate. And what is that like for young women to grow up in this kind of environment? So Porter, comments.
Yeah, I mean, I think the media's treatment of Britney Spears as a young child star and other female stars, very much young female fans are watching that and seeing how these adults are talking and sexualizing them and think that that's normal, because essentially as society, our reaction to that is, though, interviewers continue to ask questions like that, right? And those interviews continue to be shown on TV. And so we kind of subtly adapt that message, that's normal. And that's, can be extremely damaging, as young girls are trying to form their understanding of, what is acceptable ways of being treated in society.
Yeah, absolutely. And, there was another documentary that I haven't seen yet about Paris Hilton. And it seems like right now what we're doing is we're looking back on the 90s and we're really reframing everything. I mean, like for me, growing up with the Clinton Monica Lewinsky scandal, at the time I was a child, and the media really made this seem like, here's this little harlot and seducer, and this was all her fault. And it wasn't until later that I found out that she was 19 years old. And I didn't have the perspective, but how negatively that impacted my own vision of who I was as an emerging woman. and my ability to show up with any amount of power or agency, only to really look back. I mean, I was a disaster at age 19 as a result of my ACEs, but also as a result of the way that the media portrays women. So I want to ask Lou to comment on this, and then we'll go ahead and wind things down.
I feel like I'm only just getting started. I'm actually now just thinking of, hey, we need to talk about this.
Feel free to do it. We can run a couple minutes over.
We need a whole other session, but as this is the PACES community, I want to bring it back to childhood trauma. May I do that?
Yes, please.
Because I listened to all 29 minutes of Britney's the recording of Britney's testimony to the court. And I wrote some things down because she said, I'm so angry. I cry every day. It's not good for my heart. I'm trying to be so good and pretty, so perfect. What does that sound like to you? That sounds to me like the voice of a little girl trying to be so good and pretty, so perfect. My precious body who's worked for my dad. Those are her words. My precious body who's worked for my dad. So that sounds to me like childhood trauma stemming very likely from her father, that she's never going to be good enough for him, that in some ways he is contributing to the sexualization of her as a child. And here's the crux of the matter, and that is the person who was put in the position of being a conservator. That is the problem right there.
Yeah, I just want to echo, I think that's so profound, because essentially, as long as that's the case, she's continuously in this control by her abuser. And so again, that's just such a strong reflection of the lack of trauma-informed knowledge of the judicial systems.
Thank you so much, Porter. Thank you all for all of the amazing comments. There's so many of them that I highly recommend checking out Porter's blog, Lou's blog, and then of course, I invite you to join future events. We're going to be doing an event coming up on the 18th. It's a Wednesday, same time of day. And we're going to be looking at institutional child sexual abuse with a dear friend of mine who does research in this area. This is as a result of the Olympics and what the gymnasts had gone through, and also as a result of the news about the Boy Scout sexual abuse settlement. I invited her to come share her expertise and research. She actually works now in research in school systems to see how do school systems handle it when they get reports, and what resources do they need to make this better. So that announcement will go out next week for that event. I really hope that you will join us to continue this conversation. I think we really actually could talk about this all day. Like there's so much richness in it's so many levels, right? It's the child trauma that's pervasive in our society as a whole. It's the lack of trauma-informed mental health care, right? It's the mental health system that we'd like to see trauma-informed. It's the legal system that we'd like to see trauma-informed, right? How could someone who is such an abuser be put in a position of continued control? And yet, and this is also like the patriarchy. This is really the water that we're swimming in. Where, oftentimes it's women who we grow up, under the thumb of men, and the men in power and control. And it just continues to be that way our whole lives. And I think that that's something universal that many of us on this call can really relate to. And so I just want to say that I know that most of you on this call are showing up, working to make sure that people understand PACE's science, trauma-informed systems of care, and you're putting this work into practice in your communities each and every day, even though it's hard. I go through days when I don't want to do it. I don't want to read about child abuse, and I don't want to think about solving it, and I just want to stay with the covers over my head. So I just want to say how grateful I am for the work that you all show up and do each and every day. And thank you for showing up to this conversation and having these hard conversations. Thank you for your vulnerability, your open minds, and thank you for thinking critically about current events. And we look forward to doing many more Paces Connection Reacts events where we pull something from the headlines and we look at it through a trauma-informed lens. So Lou, we'll have to bring you back because having you in on this conversation was invaluable, and we would love to hear your contributions even more in the future. Porter, do you have any closing remarks? Then I'll ask Lou for closing remarks, and then we'll go ahead and close it out.
The only closing remark I have is just there was a lot of conversation in the chat about the relationship between trauma and serious mental illness. And so I just thought it was worth highlighting that certainly just because an individual has experienced trauma does not mean that inevitably they will meet the criteria for a diagnosis of serious mental illness. In fact, serious mental illness is relatively pretty rare in the United States, with only about 5% of adults meeting the criteria for serious mental illness. So I think it's important to point that out. I also think it's important to mention that for adults, for some adults with serious mental illness, there are times and periods in their lives where they are not able to make effective and healthy decisions. And so that is an instance where they do need some sort of form of fashion or of someone looking out for their well-being. But that certainly is, it can be improved how that process is handled.
Thank you for following up on that part of the chat. Lou?
I don't know why you give me the microphone, because I'll be here all day.
That's fine with me, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, goodness knows. I mean, I love this idea of Paces Connection Reacts, because so much of what we see in the news, there is that thread of trauma that is being ignored, and actually makes sense of it all once you know about trauma. So kudos to you and to this series that you're doing, very important. And for us to be able to all collectively brainstorm and come up with talking points as well. I wanted to say that just as one of the tangents we've been looking at is trauma and mental health, what's the connection? One of the things that if you haven't checked out, you might want to check out the Power Threat Meaning Network, Power Threat Meaning. And it's a bunch of very progressive psychiatrists who are looking at mental illness from a perspective of power, like who has the power and what does abuse of power and oppression, how does that impact threat? Like, are we responding to a threat? Is this just a natural survival response? And what is the meaning that we ascribe to what is happening to us from the culture and from the systems that have been set up to give us the meaning, and what is our meaning that we make out of that? So it's pretty fascinating, and it's revolutionizing the mental health field. And also Mad in America is another great site to visit. They discuss these issues, and there's a very good article that they highlighted about Britney Spears and the relation to trauma. And then lastly, I'm just about to publish another article, which is again about media and trauma and how women are portrayed. And this time it's about the vengeful woman. So I would love for you guys to look out for that and let me know what you think about that, because that's a whole other kind of side conversation to what we've been talking about today. But that's my 2 cents.
Thanks, Lou. Hopefully you'll post that new article to Paces Connection so that everyone can find it or repost it or send it to us to repost when it comes out. So thank you again so much. Lou, thank you for your expertise. Porter, thank you for your expertise. Jane, thanks for chiming in. Thanks, Karen. Thanks everyone for being here and participating. I would like to remind you all that you can save the chat before we close out by hovering your cursor over the 3 dots and selecting Save Chat. That's in the chat. If you wanted to save any resources mentioned or come back and read anyone's articles. And thank you all so much for being a part of the solution. I hope to see you at our next event. I hope to see you at our next PACES Reacts. I want to give credit to Ingrid, who's our Director of Cooperative Communities, for creating this series. And I hope to see you at my webinar about starting a PACES initiative in your community. And you will all get an email about how to join that. So thank you all so much. And I hope you have a wonderful Friday and weekend.